Hi, welcome to Faith Reimagined. I'm your host, Eliana Katchke, and I am so glad that you are with us today. This podcast is meant to be a safe, non judgmental space to have conversations about faith, theology, life, and all of the complexities that come with it. This week, we are going to be discussing mental health and the church, both the intersectionalities, the tensions, to bring awareness and insight into this conversation. We are going to be hearing from people who have had stories of being in church where their mental health may have been overlooked or bypassed or even demonized. At the end of our conversation, we will be hearing from Carrie Waller-Duholm, who is a licensed professional counselor and an ordained minister. Carrie will share her perspective of what it is like to have walked the road for about 10 years of being a pastor and then stepping into the role of therapist and how those two roles can complement each other. Our first story I'm going to share, and I have expressed permission to share it, from Lydia. Lydia wrote to me via Facebook, and she wrote to me and said, about 8 years ago, she was in a situation where she suffered major trauma, and she went to the pastor of her church, who at the time referred her to a program called Soul Care, which was a type of biblical counseling. And at the time, Lydia felt like her pastor was doing what he knew to do. Lydia found great friendship with her therapist, but it ended there. The friendship ended there. People in her church started treating her as a person non grata, someone who doesn't exist. And about 6.5 years ago, after an attempted suicide, along with struggling with self injury, depression, personality changes, she felt more alone than ever. Her small group leaders set her down and said not to talk about these issues publicly because they upset people, they made them uncomfortable. So Lydia goes off to seminary and comes back from seminary after having some healing, but is still looked at in her congregation as almost an outcast, one would say, someone who is treated as fragile and as though they're still now existent, non existent. Now, the issue with this is that is not how the church is supposed to be. The church should be a safe space. And I'm hoping that we can dive into that a little bit later. And I am here with Jennifer Evans Green. Jennifer is one of my friends from Facebook from a page called The New Evangelicals. Jennifer, we're so glad you're here with us. Can you share a little bit about your experience of being in church spaces and how that has impacted your mental health, or how it did impact your mental health while you were in those?
Yeah, I grew up going to an extremely conservative, I would call it fundamentalist, church and parochial school. My school was combined with my church, and um, so a lot of the pastors on staff were also like the superintendent of the school and that sort of thing. And any kind of counseling aside from going to one of the pastors was extremely frowned upon. And there was a time when one of my best friends, I knew she was in a very abusive household. And because we were unable to go, we were strongly discouraged from going to outside authorities at all. Um, I had gone to my youth pastor, and told him about it. And I thought that he might be able to intervene in some way to help my friend and her siblings. And the situation never got better for her, and nobody really intervened to help them at all, except for eventually her. mom was in a really bad marriage and was unable to continue to pay tuition at the school. So eventually, her siblings lost their scholarships and had to leave the school. Things just got worse for them after they left the school. So it was a very cloistered environment. And because the school very much was suspicious of outsiders and discouraged you from talking to anybody outside the school, there was a very suspicious mindset towards anybody um, like social workers and things like that from outside the government. And at one point, my family experienced a really big loss, and my little brother passed.
I'm really sorry to hear that. That's really difficult.
Thank you. Yeah, and so because it was so stigmatized and so frowned upon to get any kind of counseling, my pediatrician had told my parents that they needed to get me and my sister in counseling immediately. And they didn't want us to be looked at weird by our peers.
Mm,
So they avoided putting us in counseling. We would have been the only kids in the whole school that had ever seen a counselor. And they figured that that would be that
mm,
would be an insult to injury. So they didn't get us counseling, which
sure.
ended up causing more longer term problems for us. And, it took until I was finally on my own before I was able to actually see a counselor and get help and resolve a lot of trauma.
Okay. Our next guest is the Reverend Carrie Waller Duholm. Carrie is both an ordained minister and a licensed professional counselor. And Carrie, how long have you been in practice?
Almost 10 years.
Almost 10 years. And you recently started your own private practice?
Yes, last September, so about a year. I was going to say a year and a half, but not quite.
Not quite a year and a half. Well, that's really cool. So let's start with this. What role do you think that faith plays in the therapeutic process? And how do you incorporate spirituality, if you do, into your sessions with your clients?
Okay. I think the role faith plays in psychotherapy is the same as any worldview. It's how a person makes meaning of the world, how they decide why good things happen and bad things happen. It's for a lot of people, their faith is part of their wider community, and so that affects people's well-being, hopefully positively, but not always. So those are just a couple of the ways that faith can be intersectional with psychotherapy. And as far as incorporating it, that's always at, like with any worldview, that's at the client's request and they initiate that. So,
Okay, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. How do you or have you had to address a situation with a client where they have felt judged by their faith community or by people in their religious spectrum for their mental health struggles? Or how would you address that? What would you say to that person?
so your question is, do some people experience judgment for having mental health challenges?
Yes, specifically within faith communities, if you've experienced that, or how would you talk to somebody who has had that experience?
I think one term idea that I think can be really helpful to people is the term spiritual bypass. And a lot of some faith communities and faith leaders will do this unintentionally and without any malice by saying things like, when a parishioner would say they were in some sort of distress related to their mental health, take it to the Lord in prayer, or God doesn't give us more than we can handle, or well intentioned spiritual comments that deny the suffering of the person. And um, while I certainly do believe in the power of prayer and the Lord, I don't think that those need to be in opposition to good mental health treatment. And I think, in fact, that sort of language shames the person and takes them further away from their support system, which should include their faith community.
No, yeah, no, I can relate to that from past experiences. So it's exactly what it is spiritual bypassing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we'll wrap up with the question of what has been for you the most rewarding part of working at the intersection of faith and mental health?
Um, I think one thing that I appreciate about having had two full master's degrees of training in the different fields is that I've gotten to really be immersed in both languages and worldviews and ways of constructing the world. So when it comes to working with clients, I think what I appreciate is being able to talk with people in the language that they're using, which for a lot of people, especially here in Texas, is religious language, and being able to speak with hope and of grace and compassion. I think being a spiritually informed therapist gives me additional language to talk with people about resources that they have for healing. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, Carrie, I really do appreciate your time, just giving us some insight on what it is like to be both a therapist and a licensed minister, working in those. And I hope you have a really good day. Okay, friends, we are actually way over time. But before we go, I just wanted to share a quick story from my own personal life. About 6 years ago, I was working on recovery from alcoholism, and I was in a church space where I was just told, well, that if I prayed hard enough or if I believed God better, more enough, that I would no longer have the desire to drink. Well, let me tell you, I believed God, I prayed, I did all of the quote unquote right things, and I still struggled. I struggled for about 6.5 years until April 17th, 2023. I was finally in a church where mental health does not have a stigma around it. I have a pastor who encourages conversations about it, including medication and therapy, and actually encouraged me to say, hey, Eliana, you can go to AA. It's okay. And so, because of that, I now have 19 months sober because of somebody saying in a faith community saying it is okay to have these struggles and to use other resources. And so I hope that today's conversation enlightened you, inspired you, and stay tuned because I am sure there's going to be more. Have a great day.